The winter of 1890 in Chicago was not to be underestimated. The streets, covered in a thick layer of snow, seemed to silence the city. The biting wind whistled through the red brick buildings, as if whispering secrets of ancient times. Freight trains hurried past, their locomotives struggling to overcome the ice that stubbornly accumulated on the tracks. In that somber setting, a story of mystery began to unfold. A story that would haunt the city and leave a legacy that would never be forgotten. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our exciting stories. Tell us what city you're watching from. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Helen Abernathy, a 35-year-old woman and mother of 2 young children, was known in her neighborhood as a kind and good-natured person. She lived with her family in a small house on the outskirts of Chicago. Widowed since the birth of her youngest son, she had dedicated herself to raising her children, working as a seamstress to ensure the family's survival. Although life was difficult, Helen always found ways to keep her home warm and her children safe. On the afternoon of January 15, 1890, Helen left home as she did every afternoon. She told her children she was going for a walk in the park, something she did to clear her mind and breathe the frigid air of the season. It wasn't uncommon for her to get away for a few hours, allowing herself some peace and quiet, away from daily responsibilities. But that day, something was different. There was no longer the sound of her footsteps in the snow. Night fell and she didn't return. Her children, accustomed to her routine, began to worry. The neighborhood was soon abuzz with the woman's disappearance. The ice, the wind, and the darkness seemed to swallow any clue, making the case more perplexing with each passing minute. The police were called, but no matter how hard they searched, there was no sign of Helen. No footprints in the snow, no trace of a struggle, nothing. The city of Chicago, already marked by the hardships of the time, now found itself shrouded in a mystery that could not be easily solved. The disappearance of Helen Abernathy quickly spread beyond the limits of the neighborhood where she lived. News of her absence was published in the city's newspapers, and soon the case attracted national attention. But what really happened on that frigid night? As the days passed and winter deepened, the case remained unsolved. Witnesses said they saw Helen walking calmly towards the park in the late afternoon, but no one could say what happened after that. The police, initially reluctant to get involved in yet another common disappearance case, soon began to realize that something much bigger was at stake. It wasn't just a woman who had gotten lost in the snow-covered streets. Something was hidden. Something no one wanted to see. Among the townspeople, speculation began to grow. Some spoke of a winter tragedy, suggesting that Helen had simply succumbed to the cold and that her body was buried under the thick layer of snow. Others, however, whispered of something more sinister. They spoke of a mysterious man seen in the vicinity of the park, someone who seemed to be watching Helen on the afternoon she disappeared. But no one could identify this man. Or perhaps he was an invention, a rumor born of the town's collective fear. The truth is, nobody knew what had happened. However, one thing was certain. Helen Abernathy hadn't simply disappeared. The city was about to be swept away by a wave of mystery and terror. A case that, over the months, would transform into something even bigger and more inexplicable. As the days passed, more and more rumors began to surface. The newspapers, with their sensationalist headlines, fueled the panic, but the truth was far from being discovered. Each new clue seemed only to deepen the enigma, and the residents began to wonder, was there something or someone behind it? What if Helen hadn't just gotten lost? What if, in fact, something else had happened on that cold night in 1890? At that moment, the story of Helen Abernathy, the woman who disappeared in the snow, was just beginning, and what seemed to be a simple disappearance of a loving mother would soon turn into a mystery that would shake the foundations of Chicago. What do you think happened to Helen? Do you believe her disappearance has natural explanations, or is something darker involved? Chicago at the end of the 19th century was a city in transformation. The frigid winter air cut through the bustling streets, while smoke from factories and locomotives filled the sky, creating an atmosphere of contrasts. The urban landscape was booming, and social tensions were also on the rise. The working class, which dominated the neighborhood where Helen lived, struggled to survive the grueling working conditions in the city's industries, and life for many families seemed to be a constant battle against economic hardship. Helen Abernathy, despite adversity, was a resilient woman. She had no riches, but her life was built on what many might call simplicity. Her children, Arthur and Clara, were the center of her world. Arthur, the eldest, was 9 years old and showed precocious intelligence. His curiosity about the world around him was almost tireless, and he dreamed of a future beyond the confines of the small house where they lived. Clara, the youngest, at only 4 years old, was a sweet and innocent girl who loved to draw pictures of her family and play with handmade dolls made by her mother. Helen, however, was not just a devoted mother. She possessed a secret that few knew. Although her life was simple, she'd been raised in a wealthy family of former merchants before marrying her late husband, William Abernathy. William, however, was not what she had hoped for. He died young, leaving Helen with an enormous debt that would need to be paid off throughout her life. The transition from her luxurious life to daily struggle was one of the greatest hardships Helen had to face. Now, she was a woman who knew both the glitz of opulence and the shadows of poverty. The neighborhood where they lived, known as Near North Side, was a mix of workers and immigrants, many of whom struggled to find their place in industrial society. Helen's house, a small 2-story residence, was situated on a quiet street, covered in snow that winter. Next to her house, an Italian-owned bakery stood out, the smell of freshly baked bread filling the cold air. Around it, more simple but well-kept houses, and some factories that, even with their constant smoke and noise, gave a feeling of vibrant life. On the day Helen disappeared, her walk to the park was a routine that allowed her to escape the constant pressure. However, there was something else that afternoon. Some neighbors said they saw her leave with a worried expression, something unusual for her. But no one knew exactly what was troubling her at that moment. While the police tried to piece together the mystery, a figure began to emerge from the shadows. William Martin, one of the city's detectives, known for his skepticism and cold approach, took the lead in the investigations. Martin didn't believe in supernatural theories or fantastical stories. For him, the truth was logical and linear. However, even he couldn't deny that there was something unusual about this case. The fact that there were no tracks in the snow, the absence of witnesses, and the inexplicable calm on the night of the disappearance only deepened the mystery. The city began to speculate whether Helen's disappearance might have some connection to the business dealings her husband had left behind, a web of debts involving powerful people and shady interests. The story of Helen Abernathy spread through the streets, fueling rumors. The disappearance of such a simple and beloved woman generated a wave of empathy, but also speculation. Some said she was the victim of revenge, others that she simply disappeared of her own accord, perhaps fleeing a life she could no longer bear. But no one knew what really happened. The silence of the snow seemed to have swallowed all the truth. Do you believe Helen was the victim of something more than just a simple disappearance? What is your theory about what happened to her on that cold night? As the search for Helen Abernathy stretched through the frigid days of January, the mystery deepened. The Chicago police, though initially slow to react, were now under pressure. The disappearance of a simple woman, beloved by the community, was rapidly becoming a case of public interest. The city streets, already afflicted by the turmoil of winter, were now immersed in an atmosphere of distrust. What initially seemed a trivial event was now unsettling the nerves of the population. Detective William Martin, the man who had taken the reins of the investigation, began to realize that something was very wrong with the lack of clues about Helen's disappearance. With no footprints in the snow and no witnesses, the case became increasingly perplexing. He began questioning Helen's neighbors and friends, searching for any detail that could shed light on what had happened that afternoon. But what he found was a lot of contradictory answers and vague clues. The first to be questioned was Albert Fisher, the baker who lived next door to Helen. Albert stated that he had seen Helen pass by his bakery around 4:30 p.m. as usual. However, he noticed something different that afternoon. She seemed hurried, and unlike other days, she didn't greet anyone. She followed her routine, but with an expression that Albert described as strange. She was restless, he told the detective. She didn't seem like the same Helen as always. Albert's description, though vague, seemed intriguing to William Martin. How could such a quiet woman behave so strangely before disappearing? The feeling that something more was at stake intensified. The investigation deepened, but as it unfolded, new mysteries emerged. The police quickly discovered that shortly before her disappearance, Helen had received an anonymous letter. The letter's contents were unclear, but its tone was threatening, mentioning unpaid debts and a series of unfinished commitments that, according to the sender, needed to be fulfilled immediately. The letter was handwritten, and although the handwriting was firm, the signature was missing. No one could identify who might have sent the letter. Days turned into weeks, and as the snow continued to fall, the investigation seemed to stall. William Martin couldn't understand the reason for so much secrecy surrounding Helen. His children, Arthur and Clara, were inconsolable, and their mother's absence was beginning to affect both of their health. Arthur, who had once been a cheerful and curious boy, was now withdrawn, observing the world with a distant and worried gaze. Clara, for her part, no longer spoke, and her drawings became increasingly somber, reflecting an atmosphere of anguish. In an attempt to follow new leads, William Martin decided to investigate Helen's debts more thoroughly. When he searched through the files left by her deceased husband, he discovered something even more unsettling. William Abernathy had been involved in shady dealings with powerful people in the city. Those debts were not simple financial commitments, but were linked to a circle of corruption and shady interests that, for Martin, began to suggest that Helen's disappearance was no trivial matter. As the detective delved deeper into these shady dealings, one man's name kept popping up: James Callahan, a Chicago businessman with powerful political and financial connections. Callahan, known for his coldness and manipulation, had been largely responsible for William Abernathy's debts. At first, he was considered only a possible minor figure in the investigation. However, with each new detail uncovered, the connection between Callahan and Helen's disappearance seemed more palpable. Furthermore, Martin began receiving increasingly strange reports. Some residents said they had heard the sounds of a cart passing by on the street, even on nights when the town was completely empty. Others claimed to have seen a hooded figure moving in the vicinity of Helen's house shortly after her disappearance. But these witnesses were anonymous, and their stories, always vague, seemed only to fuel the chaos of the investigation. The situation was now more tense than ever. Helen Abernathy hadn't disappeared simply because she got lost in the snow or had an accident. Something bigger was happening, something intertwined in the shadows of the city. With each new development in the investigation, the mystery seemed to deepen, and William Martin began to question whether he was truly prepared to face the secrets that were about to be revealed. What do you think is behind Helen's disappearance? Do you believe someone powerful is involved, or is something more supernatural at play? Over time, the city of Chicago began to change its perspective on Helen Abernathy's disappearance. What had once seemed like a simple incident was now becoming a mystery, shrouded in complex layers, and the relationships between the characters were taking on greater importance in the investigation. Detective William Martin felt the pressure mounting, not only because of the case itself, but also because of the social and political repercussions that were emerging as he uncovered more about Helen's past and her family. Meanwhile, Helen's children, Arthur and Clara, were increasingly affected by their mother's absence. Arthur, who had previously admired his mother, began to exhibit increasingly rebellious behavior. He started questioning the authority of those around him, including his own father, who, although absent, still tried to maintain the family structure intact. Arthur felt that something was very wrong, and his search for the truth was intensifying. On one of the coldest nights in January, Arthur found something unusual on his small toy shelf. Deep inside, where his hands rarely reached, he discovered an old book hidden among the toys, its pages yellowed with age. The title, Mysteries of the Past, didn't reveal much, but the contents seemed directly connected to his current experiences. The pages spoke of mysterious disappearances, urban legends, and stories of female figures who vanished without a trace. Intrigued, Arthur began to study the book more closely. With each new chapter, he began to wonder if it might have something to do with what happened to his mother. Perhaps, just perhaps, his mother was involved in something much bigger than he imagined. His curiosity turned into an obsession. He began to investigate the outskirts of the city, passing through the same streets where his mother was last seen. But as he delved deeper, fear gripped his young body. He knew he was touching on something dangerous, but he couldn't turn away. As Arthur became increasingly involved in his search, the city began to take on a more sinister form. Tensions between social classes rose, and the streets, normally teeming with life, were now deserted, as if the city were preparing for a major conflict. The political crisis Chicago was experiencing began to directly affect businesses and families. And as Helen Abernathy's case grew larger, Martin discovered that the city's economic and social divisions were intrinsically linked to everything that was happening. Behind the official investigations, a subplot of political intrigue was beginning to unfold. James Callahan, the Chicago businessman linked to William Abernathy's debts, was more involved than it seemed. Besides being a cold and calculating businessman, he possessed a network of influence that extended to the corridors of power. He knew that a simple disappearance could be just the tip of the iceberg. The pressure on him mounted, especially when his company's name began to surface in the accounts of anonymous witnesses who claimed to have seen Helen at a secret meeting shortly before her departure. The situation became even more complicated when Martin discovered that some of those involved in Callahan's dealings were former political allies with ties to the city government. What seemed like a simple case of unpaid debts soon turned into something much darker, with implications for local politics and perhaps even the future of Chicago. Callahan, for his part, tried to deflect attention from his name, but as the investigations progressed, the net closed in. Meanwhile, Clara, Helen's youngest daughter, was trapped in a world of silence. She had stopped speaking soon after her mother's disappearance, and her eyes were always empty, as if she saw something beyond what any adult could perceive. Her drawings, once innocent, were now filled with dark and disconnected figures, as if she were trying to communicate with something invisible. Clara's presence became unsettling to those around her, and no one knew what to make of the changes in her behavior. The town was full of questions, but no concrete answers. The atmosphere was becoming increasingly saturated with mystery and fear, and the subplots seemed to intertwine in ways no one could have predicted. With each new step Martin took, he found himself more entangled in a web of political intrigue, broken personal relationships, and elements of a supernatural mystery that was slowly beginning to take shape before his eyes. It was no longer just a disappearance. It was something deeper, more dangerous. And the pieces of this puzzle were coming together in a way no one could control. What do you think is going on with Arthur and Clara? Do you believe they are involved in something that goes beyond their mother's disappearance? And what's your opinion of James Callahan? Does he have anything to do with Helen's disappearance? The investigation into Helen Abernathy's disappearance has finally reached a critical point. The previously unconnected pieces of the puzzle have begun to unsettlingly align, and the mystery that has shrouded Chicago is becoming increasingly complex. But amidst all the tension, a startling revelation is about to change the course of history. On a cold February night, William Martin received a letter with no return address. It was sealed with a strange symbol, something he didn't recognize. Inside, there was a single handwritten line that seemed to be addressed directly to him. "If you want to know what happened to Helen, follow the clues that no one else can see." The letter, though vague, seemed to hold the key to a new direction in the investigation. The detective, with his usual skepticism, didn't know what to think. Was it a ploy by someone trying to take advantage of the case, or in fact a legitimate clue that would lead him closer to the truth? His intuition told him he was close to discovering something important. Without wasting any time, Martin decided to follow the only concrete clue he had, the symbol. He began researching and discovered that the same symbol was related to an ancient secret society that had operated in Chicago in previous decades. This society, known as the Order of Ice, was famous for its mysterious practices and involvement with the city's most powerful circles. The Order had a history shrouded in secrecy and, according to ancient accounts, was associated with rituals that combined occult elements with illicit dealings. The connection to the Abernethys, though vague, began to become clearer. As the days passed, Martin followed new clues, which led him to a secluded mansion on the outskirts of Chicago, belonging to a man named Edmund Blackwell, an old businessman with close ties to James Callahan. Blackwell, who had retired from public life years before, was a central figure in the activities of the Order of Ice. Martin had learned that he was directly involved in William Abernethy's illicit dealings, but now he was beginning to suspect that Blackwell was also somehow connected to Helen's disappearance. The detective arrived at Blackwell's mansion on the night of February 22nd, where snow covered the road like a heavy white blanket. The house, with its darkened windows and weathered facade, had the appearance of a forgotten place. But what Martin found inside made him question everything he knew up to that point. In an underground room filled with old books and unknown symbols, Martin discovered something that would make the story take a completely unexpected turn. A diary, apparently belonging to Helen Abernethy. The diary was hidden in a secret drawer, carefully sealed with red wax. The pages were filled with accounts of Helen's life before her marriage, a time she had never mentioned to anyone. However, the most shocking discovery was a series of entries that spoke of the Order of Ice and the secret dealings she was being forced to participate in. Helen, who until then seemed to be an ordinary woman, was involved in a circle of power and corruption that no one knew existed. Helen's diary also revealed that, in the months leading up to her disappearance, she had begun to fear for her life. She was being threatened by someone within the secret society and apparently had tried to escape this web of manipulation. Most disturbing was the fact that she knew something none of the other members knew. A secret, something that could destroy the very foundation of Callahan and Blackwell's power. As Martin read the final pages, Helen's last entry sent a dizzying sensation through his stomach. She mentioned a secret meeting that would take place on the day of her disappearance, a gathering of powerful figures in the city where a crucial decision would be made. What she wanted to reveal, however, was never stated in the diary. The last sentence, written in trembling handwriting, read, "They know I'm close to the truth. I am the last piece." Martin, now with more questions than answers, realized that Helen Abernethy's disappearance had not been an accident. She was involved in something much bigger than he had imagined, and her attempt to escape the Order of Ice seemed to have led to a deadly chase. From that moment on, the detective knew he was dealing with forces far beyond his comprehension. But before he could ask any more questions, the ground shook a window burst open with a loud crack, and a mysterious figure appeared in the doorway. "You're closer to the truth than you think," the figure said in a deep, low voice. "But be warned, detective, some truths should not be revealed." What do you think Helen was about to reveal? Was she the victim of a larger conspiracy within the secret society? And who is the mysterious figure that appeared at the end? The impact of Martin's revelations reverberated throughout Chicago. The discovery of Helen Abernathy's diary and her involvement with the Order of Ice began to bring unexpected consequences, not only for the investigation, but for the lives of everyone involved. The detective, who previously saw himself as simply trying to solve a case, now found himself at the center of a plot far more complex and dangerous than he had ever imagined. When Martin returned to the police department carrying the diary and notes Helen had made, he knew he was dealing with something much bigger than a simple disappearance. Helen's words about the last piece and the secret meeting had become an enigma he couldn't solve alone. The idea that she was about to reveal something that could destroy the power base of men like James Callahan and Edmund Blackwell was now clearer than ever. However, the feeling of being surrounded by invisible forces soon took hold of the detective. He knew he was being watched. Every time he tried to make a call or talk to someone about the case, something seemed to prevent him from moving forward. He began to realize that his own life was in danger. The threat he faced came not only from common criminals, but from a network of powerful and mysterious individuals who were willing to do anything to keep their secrets buried. At home, Arthur began acting increasingly strangely. His obsession with his mother's disappearance had become almost unbearable. He spent hours reading the book Mysteries of the Past, searching for answers, and began taking notes in a notebook where he drew diagrams and tried to connect the events he had witnessed. He felt there was something about his mother that he still didn't understand, something hidden not only from him, but from everyone around him. One night, while walking through the frozen streets of Chicago, Arthur had a vision. He was near the park where his mother had last been seen, and in the darkness of the night, something called to him. In the center of the park, he saw a hooded figure approaching. Without thinking, he followed the figure, which seemed to guide him to an old building, an abandoned structure that somehow seemed familiar. The figure, moving with the precision of someone who knew the place well, led Arthur to a hidden door at the back of the building. When he entered, darkness enveloped his body and mind. However, inside, he found a series of old photos and documents that seemed directly linked to the Abernathy family and the Order of Ice. There were records of secret meetings, coded names, and notes indicating that the Abernathy family, behind their simple facade, were deeply involved with this secret society. Arthur, feeling he had taken a decisive step in his quest for the truth, began to understand what his mother had done to escape the Order of Ice. She was not only being pursued, but had been part of a larger conspiracy. However, as he examined the documents, he heard a noise coming from the door. The hooded figure was watching him. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. The feeling of being hunted had never been so palpable. Meanwhile, Martin's investigation was also reaching a breaking point. The discovery that the Order of Ice was not just a secret society with commercial interests, but that its roots were deeply intertwined with politics and corruption in Chicago, led to a series of unexpected reactions. The detective began receiving direct threats, with notes left on his desk and anonymous messages telling him to give up his search. He knew he was being monitored all the time, but now he also feared for Arthur and Clara's safety. One night, while reviewing his notes, Martin was interrupted by an unexpected visit. James Callahan, the Chicago businessman who had previously been a distant and tangential figure in the case, now stood before him with a cold, calculated smile. "You're getting closer to the truth, detective," Callahan said with a disconcerting calm. "But you don't understand what you're doing. There are things that, if revealed, could destroy far more than your investigation. And that includes your own life. Callahan was no longer just trying to deflect attention from himself. He was making a direct threat to Martin. But the detective, in his stubborn spirit, knew he couldn't back down. He was closer to the truth than ever before, and he knew his only option was to move forward, even if it meant confronting those too powerful to be defeated. What do you think Arthur will discover in this mysterious place? And how do you think Callahan is involved in Helen's disappearance? Is he trying to protect something even darker? The following days were marked by a growing sense of urgency and tension. Chicago, under the frigid cloak of winter, seemed a paralyzed city, but the revelations and dark secrets being unearthed by William Martin and Arthur Abernathy were beginning to change their lives forever. Both were getting closer to the truth, but at what cost? Arthur, though still young, was beginning to take shape in what resembled a detective. His search for his mother had led him to uncover a dark side of his family, and now he knew that the life he knew wasn't what it seemed. When he found the abandoned building and the secret documents, he felt a mixture of fear and determination. The boy, who had once been merely a victim of his mother's disappearance, now saw himself as someone who could change the course of that story. He couldn't let fear paralyze him, but he knew that any wrong move could put his life at risk. That night, as he left the building, Arthur was followed by a shadow. The hooded figure which had led him there always seemed to be ahead of him, never letting him escape. But now, instead of running away or panicking, Arthur felt something new within him: courage. He knew he needed to confront the one who was watching him. In the darkness of the night, he turned and faced the figure. "Who are you?" Arthur asked, his voice trembling but determined. The figure didn't respond immediately, but then, slowly, removed his hood. To his surprise, the person before him was not a stranger, but someone he knew very well: Edmund Blackwell, the old businessman who was involved in his family's secret dealings. Blackwell looked at Arthur with a wry smile. "You're braver than you thought, boy," Blackwell said, his voice smooth as a sharp blade. "But know that there are things in Chicago that shouldn't be discovered, and you're about to get lost on a path of no return." Arthur, though shaken by the revelation, did not back down. "I know you have something to do with my mother's disappearance, and I will find out the truth, no matter what." Blackwell's reply was enigmatic. "You don't understand what you're doing. Your mother knew too much and, in trying to escape, made a fatal mistake. Now it's up to you to decide whether you want to follow your destiny or remain in ignorance. What you discover here will change everything." While Arthur faced his own dilemma and revelations, William Martin was also undergoing a transformation. The detective, who had begun the investigation with immense skepticism, now found himself forced to rethink everything he believed about life and the world around him. He knew he could no longer rely solely on logic. What he was dealing with was not a simple criminal network. He was dealing with a web of power, manipulation, and perhaps even something beyond human comprehension. The following morning, Martin returned to the police department, but his mind was elsewhere. Callahan's words echoed in his head. "There are things that, if revealed, could destroy far more than your investigation." What should he do about this threat? He knew he was walking a fine line, where one wrong step could mean not only the end of his career, but of his life. The truth was within his grasp, but he couldn't simply ignore the risks involved. But what disturbed him most was not just the physical danger. It was the fact that he was beginning to understand that in unearthing the truth about Helen, he was also unearthing something within himself. He could no longer remain neutral. He now saw himself as part of a larger story, a power game that transcended the boundaries of morality and justice. It was a game where there were no clear winners, only victims. When Martin visited Helen Abernathy's house once more, he realized something he had overlooked. The reflection of her own life was in everything she had left behind: the small details, the personal objects, the photos, The letters, everything there seemed to tell a story she hadn't been able to finish. She knew the truth, but her choices had led her down a path of no return. Now, Martin knew he had to make the same choice. Tension was building. For Arthur, there was no turning back. He knew he would face immense obstacles, but the truth about his mother and the power that had corrupted the city propelled him forward. For Martin, the choices were equally complicated. He was willing to risk his life and his career, but what truth would he uncover? And more importantly, would that truth bring justice or only more destruction? As the frigid winter continued to blanket Chicago, the future of both Arthur and Martin stood at a turning point. They had overcome their initial fear, they had grown in the face of adversity, but in doing so, they had placed themselves in a position where the truth could be more dangerous than any lie. Do you think Arthur will be able to cope with what he's discovered about his mother? And Martin, will he be able to uncover the truth without losing himself along the way? The city of Chicago had never seemed so dense and suffocating as it did now. Winter stretched on, but with it came a premonition that something big was about to happen. William Martin, with his discoveries and threats, felt he was on the verge of something irreversible. He knew that the mystery surrounding the disappearance of Helen Abernathy and the Order of Ice was about to culminate in a final confrontation, and nothing would ever be the same again. The pieces were falling into place, but with each revelation, more questions arose. The detective had an uneasy feeling that the moment was approaching. He was no longer just an investigator of common crimes. He was now in a battle against a network of powerful people who used both political influence and covert practices to maintain their control. Helen's diary, the documents Arthur found, and the clues Martin had unearthed over the weeks now connected clearly. The Order of Ice was not a simple secret society. It had deep roots in the social fabric of Chicago, and its members controlled much more than it seemed at first glance. Martin could no longer trust anyone. The anonymous messages became more frequent and direct, the eyes watching him in the streets more menacing. Callahan, the ruthless businessman, knew Martin was getting too close to the truth, and silencing him wouldn't be easy. But what troubled the detective most was the growing presence of Edmund Blackwell, the man who seemed to be the link between all the events. Now Martin knew he needed to confront him once and for all. With that thought in mind, Martin headed to Blackwell's mansion, his last hope of discovering what lay behind this entire network. The isolated and imposing building was shrouded in a fog of mystery. Blackwell, a cold and calculating man, always seemed to be one step ahead. But finally, the detective believed there was something the man couldn't avoid. Meanwhile, Arthur was also preparing for the decisive moment. His personal journey had led him to meet Blackwell, but now he knew that his quest would not simply be about discovering what happened to his mother. It was something much deeper. He needed to understand the role of his family, his father, and how they were all connected to the Order of Ice. The book Arthur had found, Mysteries of the Past, now seemed to make more sense than ever. His mother's notes, the mention of the secret society, the coded names, everything indicated that Helen had been more than a victim. She was a key piece in this game. But what Arthur didn't know was how far he was willing to go to uncover the truth. Fear, anger, and pain mingled within him, and as he drew closer to Blackwell, he knew his life would never be the same. He was ready to confront the secrets his mother had tried to hide, to understand his own role within that web of corruption and power. But would it be too late to turn back? Tension was rising. Winter was at its peak, with snow falling incessantly like a blanket of silence covering the city. Chicago seemed to be awaiting a resolution, and all paths now converged on one point: the confrontation with Edmund Blackwell. Detective Martin knew this would be the decisive moment, the point of no return. He had already lost count of how many threats he had received, how many eyes had turned against him. But what bothered him most was the fact that he knew something much bigger was at stake, something that could change the city forever. The clock was ticking. The icy wind cut through the streets, and the snow seemed endless. The city was about to be revealed, and the secrets that had been buried for so long were about to come to light. But the question that remained was, how far were the characters willing to go to discover the truth? Do you believe that Martin and Arthur will be able to confront Blackwell and reveal the truth? What consequences do you think they will face in this final confrontation? The night in Chicago was cold and silent, but the air was thick with the tension of an impending showdown. The normally bustling streets seemed deserted as the city prepared for the great confrontation. William Martin, with Helen Abernathy's diary in hand and the truth beginning to unfold, was more determined than ever to confront the man who seemed to be the epicenter of this entire conspiracy, Edmund Blackwell. He knew this would be his last chance to solve the mystery and expose everything that was hidden. Arriving at Blackwell's mansion, Martin felt a wave of insecurity. The imposing building before him seemed more like a fortress than a house, and the feeling of being watched had never been stronger. But he could no longer back down. The truth was within his grasp, and he was willing to face it, even if it meant risking his life. Upon entering the mansion, Martin was greeted by an unexpected sight. Edmund Blackwell, seated calmly in an armchair, as if he already knew the detective was coming. The old businessman looked at him with an enigmatic smile, as if he were waiting for the moment to reveal what he knew. "You've come closer than I expected, Martin," Blackwell said in a low, authoritative voice. "But the truth you seek comes at a very high cost, and there are secrets that, if revealed, could destroy more than you can imagine." Martin, without hesitation, placed the diary on Blackwell's desk. "I know your Order of Ice is behind this. I know Helen Abernathy was trying to escape something bigger, something involving the corruption of the entire city." Blackwell didn't move, but his expression shifted subtly. He didn't seem surprised, just resigned. Helen was a key player, but she couldn't grasp the game she was involved in. The Order of Ice isn't just a secret society. We're a network of power, of influence, that controls Chicago down to the smallest detail. And, like any power game, there are sacrifices. Martin approached, anger rising in his chest. "You killed her, didn't you? You and everyone else in your organization. She was trying to escape, but you couldn't let that happen." Blackwell sighed, as if explaining a great truth. Helen knew too much, but she wasn't a victim. She was a player. She wanted to take control of the situation, but she was foolish to think she could get away with it. In the end, we all have a role to play in this game, and your role, detective, is next. Those words echoed in Martin's mind as he began to grasp the true extent of corruption in Chicago. Helen Abernathy's disappearance was no simple family tragedy. It was part of a larger strategy, a key piece in a game where people were merely numbers to be moved. Blackwell and the Order of Ice were in control of everything, manipulating even the laws and institutions to keep their power untouched. However, Martin couldn't simply accept this truth. He knew there was something more, something Blackwell was hiding. It was then that, upon examining the documents again, he found a photograph hidden among the pages of Helen's diary. It was a photo of a secret meeting of the Order of Ice. But upon closer inspection, Martin noticed something alarming. In the image, he himself was there, alongside Blackwell and other members of the society. The photo was taken years ago, before his arrival in Chicago. "You were there the whole time," Martin said, the discovery hitting him like a ton of stones. "You used me. I was just a pawn in your game." Blackwell smiled, his face now reflecting a certain pleasure. "Ah, Martin, you always knew something was wrong, but you never wanted to believe the truth. You were chosen, detective. The Order needed someone like you, someone with access to the circles of power, someone who could do whatever was necessary without asking questions." The revelation came as a profound shock to Martin. Not only was he surrounded by lies, but he had been an active part of the game all along, without knowing it. His own investigative journey, his desire to find the truth, had been manipulated from the start. Meanwhile, Arthur Abernathy, following his own path, had also arrived at the final confrontation. After being guided to Blackwell's mansion, he now faced a dilemma: reveal the truth about his mother and family, or join the power network he so despised. When he entered the room, his eyes met Martin's, and it was as if everything had finally fallen into place. Arthur already knew the truth about his mother, but now he also knew that his own future rested in the hands of that decision. Martin looked at Arthur, his eyes saying everything he needed to know. "We both know what we need to do," he said, his voice full of determination. It was at that moment, at the climax of the story, that Martin and Arthur's destinies became irrevocably intertwined. They both knew that the truth needed to be revealed, and that nothing would ever be the same after that night. Now that the truth about the Order of Ice has been revealed, what do you think will happen to Martin and Arthur? Will they have the strength to confront the corrupt system that Blackwell represents? The Chicago night stretched on silently, but the weight of the choices made by William Martin and Arthur Abernathy could not be ignored. The city, which had once seemed so distant from its own dilemmas, now carried the echoes of the revelations that had been unearthed. What began as a search for answers about Helen Abernathy's disappearance had now become a cry of resistance against a system that had been manipulated for years, governed by those who hid in the shadows. Edmund Blackwell, the man who seemed to be the cornerstone of this power network, had been confronted. The Order of Ice, which until then seemed indestructible, was crumbling before the evidence. Martin, though still shaken by the truth that he had been manipulated, knew that his actions had initiated a chain of events that could not be undone. He didn't know if he would be able to live with the weight of the revelation, but at least he had brought light to the darkness that dominated Chicago. Arthur, on the other hand, had made his own choice. Alongside Martin, he finally understood his mother's true role and his own connection to the Order of Ice. He was not only a victim of corruption, but also a hero in his own journey. Young Abernathy knew that, although his life would never be simpler, he was now ready to grapple with his family's legacy and his own identity. His decision to help Martin uncover the truth was a significant step in his transformation from a boy searching for answers to a man who stood against the system that destroyed his mother. The city of Chicago, though still covered in snow, now seemed to have a chance for change. The investigations would continue, the guilty would be brought to justice, and the pieces of the corruption network would finally begin to unravel. But most importantly, Martin and Arthur had achieved something: the truth. Although there were consequences, such as the loss of life and the downfall of many powerful figures, the greatest triumph was the freedom to live without the shackles of lies. Martin knew that nothing would ever be the same again. He had lost so much during this journey. His career, his trust in the system, and even his own sense of identity had been shaken. But he also knew that alongside Arthur there was something stronger than fear or doubt: the power of truth. And in a world where lies were used to control and manipulate, the truth had immeasurable power. Arthur, for his part, gazed at the city skyline, now clearer than ever. He knew the fight wasn't over. Although the Order of Ice was weakened, there were many other organizations like it, disguised under a cloak of respectability. But now he was ready to face them. The icy wind cut through the streets, but there was something different in the air, something refreshing. Chicago finally seemed to breathe more freely. Now that the truth has been revealed and the Order of Ice is in ruins, what do you think Martin and Arthur will do with what's left of this story? Will they find peace, or will the fight against corruption continue? Months had passed since the fall of the Order of Ice, and Chicago was slowly beginning to rebuild. William Martin, now calmer and more reflective, continued his career in the police force, but with a more critical view of the system. He knew his journey had changed everything, but somehow he felt freer. Arthur Abernathy, for his part, had distanced himself from Chicago, deciding to start a new life far from the shadow of corruption that had haunted his family for so long. But something inside him knew that the fight against evil would never end. The engagement question at the end of this chapter could be, with the end of the Order of Ice, do you think Martin and Arthur will finally find peace? Or is the fight against evil far from over? What do you think awaits these characters in the future? William Martin and Arthur Abernathy's journey has come to an end, but the fight against corruption and power never truly ends. What do you think the future holds for these characters? The truth has been revealed, but will the peace they seek be lasting? Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us what you thought of the story. And if you felt inspired, be sure to share it with your friends so that more people can discover this plot full of mystery and twists. Your opinion is very important to us.